Today we're going to be talking about the fundamentals of mobile application development. And with that comes the fundamental problems of mobile application development as it exists today. And the first of those four problems are the conflicting mobile priorities, starting with OS fragmentation. A couple of years back, it was a pretty simple OS world. People used BlackBerry for email and Windows Mobile for task-specific type of applications. And that was pretty much the world as it existed. Well, if we fast forward to 2010, now we've got things like the iPhone and the Android products, as well as Symbian, RIM, and Windows Mobile, all still vying for the attention of the enterprise user. And this fragmentation obviously is not going to end anytime soon. In fact, it will probably get worse before it gets better. At the same time, the requirements for applications are growing exponentially, as both consumerized types of applications like your Pandoras and your Shazams and things like that, but also as people try and use mobility to decrease costs by extending existing applications, whether they be dispatch and asset management type of applications, or Salesforce automation applications, to a wider and wider group of devices, operation systems, and users. Now, what this means for IT is that IT is going to have to develop mobile as a core competency, and understanding the different types of architectures, decision criteria, and platforms to support all these different divergent requirements will become a core skill set within IT, whether we like it or not. If we move on to the next slide, we've been talking here at Gartner about the 6 styles of mobile architecture, and these 6 styles are represented here. Now, the ones we really think about most frequently for enterprise applications, they are thick client, rich client, and messaging type of client. Now, thin client type of applications are really more your web-based apps, and while we think they'll grow dramatically in the next couple of years, they're not really used too frequently. The rich client primarily are downloadable applications or applications that are permanently resident on the device and have some degree of offline functionality. Messaging clients really are your email and your SMS and your MMS type clients, but again, really aren't used for a lot, although recently we have seen some users feel like they're streaming audio and video clients for training and knowledge sharing. Primarily today, we're going to focus on the thin client and the rich client, as they have been seeing the most growth recently, and also provide the highest level of functionality. At the same time, because of that high level of functionality, they require a fair amount of customization to work on all these different diverse operating systems. The punchline obviously is that the appropriate architecture will be determined primarily by those audience requirements. And as you'll see later on in the presentation, the appropriate architecture may be multiple architectures for a single application. And in fact, a single application in most cases will utilize 1, 2, or 3 of these simultaneously. To be quite frank, if you're not starting to look at this whole area today, you're already a little bit behind the 8 ball. What most organizations are finding is that they think, okay, we know that we are behind the 8 ball. We don't have the time or the manpower to really examine this problem as it needs to be examined. This is why we're starting to see more and more outsourcing of the problem. So they'll push the actual hosting or the actual development of the actual application itself outside, while they build up a knowledge base and detailed understanding. So while I would say that most organizations are starting to attack this problem, some of that attack is happening by just saying, you know, we can't currently do this, so let's outsource it. This being a Gartner presentation, we always talk about key issues. And these are some pretty common key issues in how mobile applications and technologies will evolve and how they enable business processes. So it's interesting that as people begin to dip their toe in the water and understand how these applications will enable better business processes for more efficient use of people and assets, they're attacking it from many different ways. The mobile multi-platform development tools or cross-platform development tools like Roam Mobile or Appcelerator are the way that people are dipping their toe in the water. Most organizations, when they develop the application, find that the infrastructure is good for putting something out there quickly, but not necessarily something you want to work with every single day. This quickly moves people past the operational toolkits, which are appropriate in some cases, into the operational platforms. Again, that's where we're going to spend further time today in talking about some of these operational platforms. What we mean by operational platform is that they include the development tools, they include a lot of operational toolkit functionalities, whether those be security and management of the devices and or the data on those devices, or perhaps even the application management. They also include all the bits and pieces that you need to connect these mobile applications that you build in the development toolkit to all your back-end data sources and all your application stores. In many cases, you'll have pre-built applications, or at the bare minimum, application templates that you can put together, customize, and roll out relatively rapidly. As most companies do that, as their first multi-platform development tools and operational toolkits will migrate to the fully functioning mobile enterprise application platforms over the long term, which of course brings us to a magic quadrant. We can't have a Gartner presentation without a magic quadrant, because it's actually illegal to do so. We have on this slide the 2010 Mobile Enterprise Application Platform Magic Quadrant, and this was published in January 2010. We're actually in the process of updating this currently, and obviously, as you can see, there's a couple of leaders here: Antenna Software, Cyclo, and Sybase. Sybase, as everyone I'm sure has heard, was recently purchased by SAP. That will be an interesting merger, because they're going to be taking a best-of-breed platform technologies and integrating with some interesting applications. Obviously, that's going to take some time. Cyclo is also a very interesting one in this space, because they have for a long time really focused on the enterprise asset management space. But recently, they have really built up that platform a fair amount to enable some new applications and also a fair amount of customization. Antenna is another interesting one here, and we like these guys because, as we said earlier, a lot of folks really aren't prepared to bring all this knowledge and all these capabilities in-house, and Antenna is a great model for hosted type of development where they can host your application. They have some great pre-built apps as well, some fantastic templates, and a really good application development platform. Another interesting one here is Pyxis 2, and we like Pyxis because their platform for development is a really, really nice one. They don't have all the capabilities for deep, thick client type of applications, and their connectors are maybe not as advanced as the ones you'll see from Sybase or Antenna, but we still think they're a real interesting choice for organizations that are building mobile apps for their employees. Now, what I wanted to do in this next slide is really talk a little bit about what people are actually doing out there and really talk about why they're doing it. If you think about mobile email as it exists today, that really is the dominant mobile application. It continues to be the dominant mobile application and has been for quite some time, and is pretty much the reason why we have all this infrastructure out there to build to. What I mean by infrastructure is I mean the devices and the data platforms or the data programs that are purchased for those devices. So we have a multitude of messaging clients out there. Now, we're starting to see some companies really develop and build on applications that are thin and or rich client, the difference between thin and rich client being the amount of application data that's stored on the device. Primarily in the past, we've seen a lot of thick clients for asset management and dispatch and other types of applications. But as the application audience grows and these applications number more than one or two, we're starting to see more and more rich client. In parallel, we've seen an increase in coverage and the reliability of the networks. Lastly, I mentioned thin client. We really think there are some early adopter type applications for information distribution and things like that, but the real problems with thin client surface when you start to get very advanced applications or really intricate UI manipulation. So if we look at the long-term strategies here in the 2010 to 2013 outlook, we have all these platforms that people have built up, single-focus applications or task-specific type of applications. And now we're in that early mainstream phase where your mobile enterprise application platforms and your consumer app platforms and your packaged mobile apps are all coming together. In many cases, these have been purchased by different lines of business, where sales and marketing tends to manage the consumer activities, and the operations guys have bought the mobile apps. Then you've got IT, who in many cases focus more on the mobile enterprise application platforms. We think these systems have got to come together in the next couple of years, and this will likely be led by IT as they begin to take inventory of the different applications that are out there and start to understand if the hardware devices can indeed be supported, can be secured, and can be managed. It's critical that the application and the data on mobile devices can be secured and managed as the platforms begin to merge together. The technologies have an application to access data stores in the back end and push application data out to a wide variety of operation systems. The requirements are often the same, and so duplicating this functionality over and over again within a data center or an IT shop is somewhat silly. So what we really think is going to happen is that you're going to see a bifurcation of the market, where you have applications and experience platforms addressing these mobile app platforms, and then generic client application development, as it exists today, will increasingly focus on mobile. There are substantially more mobile devices out there than there are PCs. So I talked a lot about the different architectures, and I don't want to make them sound like they happen independently. So what I've done is put an example of an application that illustrates how multiple architectures deliver a single functionality or a single business process to an end user. I used the mobile banking example because I think it's one we can all relate to. So the first step of the mobile application in this particular case is going to be a check cashing type of app. You utilize your phone to take a picture of a check, and that check is then deposited in your account. This is an application that exists today and is offered from a number of different banks. Let's say you now take the check cashing application and you receive an SMS message or an MMS message that tells you when those funds are available. Embedded within that SMS message is a hot link, and you tap on that hot link and it launches a browser session to pay bills and transfer funds. Now, each of those architectures enables a certain type of functionality. Because it's a downloadable client and it exists on the device, it has access to a resource of that device. That resource could be location. It could be a camera. It could be a number of things. Now, SMS is delivered as soon as it's sent, so you don't have to launch an application, and you don't have to launch a browser session in order to receive that message. And lastly, because that browser session is occurring on the device, you really don't have information about account and other payees or other sensitive things like that resident on the device once the browser window is closed. Keep in mind, these devices are lost and stolen frequently, so you never want very sensitive, very secure information permanently resident on the device. So, is that one application or is that many applications? We really see it as one business process enabled by a number of different architectures in a single application. So let's not think about these architectures in silos. Rather, let's think about them in terms of the way they enable business processes to happen. The question always comes up, well, this is all fine and good, but what's it going to cost me? What we did here was we ran a total cost of ownership study across the board. We looked at software as a service, or hosted type offerings versus MEAP, versus application packages, and compared costs over the course of a 3-year investment time frame. Now at the outset, you're packaged on premises, and your MEAP with components are going to cost more at the outset, because there's a significant upfront investment for server and integration costs. In many cases, your software as a service or your hosted type offerings have a much lower upfront cost. In longer term, those costs tend to go up a little bit. Now, what this TCO doesn't take into account is a lot of data center and the hosting type of models. And so what you really want to do is to see how much it's actually going to cost you to host this stuff within your own data center. Net, if you want to get started quickly, and you don't necessarily want to spend a lot up front, you're probably better off going with a host-type solution. In the longer term, you may wish to move some of that in-house. On the other hand, if you're okay with a 3 to 5 year investment type of model, you may want to take that upfront cost first, then amortize that over a longer period of time, or a greater number of years. Now, a question that we get frequently is, what about HTML5? Doesn't that just remove the need for client applications? Isn't everything just going to be done on the browser? Well, it's a great story, but the problem is threefold. First and foremost, different browsers are interpreting HTML5 differently and in different time frames. So currently, there are HTML5 browsers on some smartphones, but not others, and even fewer of those actually have a standardized version of that. Secondly, decaching is the sort of holy grail of HTML5. This is the ability to run an application offline, but it has not been implemented in a very standardized fashion across every single browser. Lastly, when you're accessing resource, such as cameras and present location on the device, there is no standardized methodology for accessing these, so you may have to develop different HTML5 download applications for different browsers or different devices. There's no consistency unless you go from device class to device class. So this tells us that for quite some time, for very rich type of applications, particularly ones that require access to resource from the device, you still do need client development. Potentially, this could entail single client development and recode for each different device. Longer term, over a 5 to 6 year time frame, perhaps HTML5 download and the standardization of resource on the device will enable you to move a growing number of applications to a more browser-based model. However, because it always takes place within the browser environment, you'll be limited in the fine-grained UI manipulation that you can do. I think the first thing in the decision-making framework is to understand the audience and the timing of your application. So if you're looking for something to get out there in 6 months and you need it to last a couple of years, then you're very likely going to look at some packaged mobile applications or even some hosted packaged mobile applications. But if you're looking at this strategically and you're saying this is something that I'm going to have to work with for the next 3 to 5 years, then you really want to start looking at platforms. I say that because over the next 3 years, we're going to see at least 2 to 3 revisions of every OS that we're working with. And we're going to see the Android guys really grow in prominence. We're going to see RIM continue to grow. We're going to see Windows Mobile back off a little bit. And we're going to see the iPhone continue to grow in its enterprise relevance. So over these next 3 years, you're talking about 4 OSs, which you're likely going to have to talk to, and 2 to 3 revisions per year of each of those OSs. That's a lot of recoding. That's a lot of redevelopment. And what the organization needs to do, push that problem out to the platform providers, as opposed to trying to handle it themselves. Secondly, your requirement for the number of mobile applications that you're going to have to support is going to grow pretty dramatically over the next couple of years. Successful applications tend to breed additional successful applications. And so while you may have a great asset management or dispatch app out there, you can bet within the Salesforce or within the other operational departments, they're clamoring for additional applications. So step 1, begin to categorize your mobile applications, and you can utilize this chart to categorize them based on agility, importance, and lifespan. You start to get into that, and eventually you realize that you'll cluster these applications around lifespan, or on complexity, or on delivery, and around how strategically important they are to running the business. This will help you make decisions about platforms versus packaged apps, and the likely speed of delivery for all of them. Hopefully, we've covered all these recommendations within the presentation, and I'm just going to run through them again quickly. As a starting point, on Monday, take inventory of what you have out there. I think most organizations will be relatively surprised at the number of mobile applications which your enterprise is already supporting. When we tell people to take this inventory, a lot of times we get the response, well, we had no idea the guys in operations had this asset management thing going. And we had no idea the guys in sales and marketing have already distributed 4 or 5 applications out to our customer base. So take that inventory today and also get an idea from the business units what they're asking for in terms of mobile apps and what the audience and intended purpose is for those apps. Secondly, as you compile that list, you want to sit down and identify which architectures are going to be the most appropriate for delivering the business function for those currently supported app groups, as well as the ones in the future. Next, you want to align the sourcing strategies for the lifespan and the requirement of those applications, so you utilize the appropriate sourcing methodology, whether it's a software-to-service model, a hosted model, or some combination of that, plus owned infrastructure. Now, over the next 6 to 12 months, it really comes down to IT, to establish your architectural standard, your device standard, your technology network standards for what's going to be supported internally and what you're going to push out to other vendors. What you need to do is narrow down the number of software platforms and architectures that you're going to have to support as much as possible. When you start taking that inventory, just start listing out all the software vendors that you're using for everything, from app development to deployment to management, security, and you'll be surprised at the number of software vendors that are in-house. You'll want to narrow that down as much as possible. Fewer vendors, fewer complexities, less integration exercises.